what is often a legitimate grievance is, at worst, for us, counterproductive, but at best for us, it isolates the people who are in the most need of help. Women who have a grievance against an abuser, people who are being ostracized from social circles because they are calling out oppressive systems within them, people who often have no other place to go. This speech will be structured pretty simply. I'll give a picture of the norm, I'll explain what we think the counterfactual would be, and then I'll split up the rest of my speech into two cases. People who don't get over this grudge and people who do get over the grudge. Let's talk about the history of the norm. The first thing to say about this is that overwhelmingly the stigma against people who hold grudges emerged from sexism, for the central reason that there is a deeply held sexist trope in society that women are irrational, and that when women experience grievances in their life, they are not being serious and they are using that to weaponize against men. And consequently, the stigma that has emerged against people who hold grudges disproportionately affects women who have grudges, but also is inherently bound up with norms of sexism. Secondly, the overwhelming encouragement of this norm, we would say, is to push people towards getting rid of to hasten the process of getting over a grudge, we would hold that grudges are kind of broadly rational, but obviously some people get over them, and the process of this norm is just like, get over it quickly, because it is not rational. Thirdly, it affects grudges of all lengths, whether you've held a grudge for a day or whether you've held a grudge for 10 years, the norm still affects you. It still tells you that the grudge is not something you should hold, it is rational, and something you should put to the side, if only for the purpose of maintaining social peace. What happens in the counterfactual? And the most important thing to note here is that grudges are going to exist in either world. The human experience of grievance is the thing that guarantees that people have grudges, no matter what the norms existing around them are. Because, just consider the huge scale of things that cause people to have grievances. Some people have grudges over an annoying social media post that someone made, or a score that happened in a debate, 10 years ago. Some people also have grievances about things like sexual assault. They have grievances around really serious issues of abuse. I don't think either team is going to have the capacity in this debate to establish that the human experience of grievance and a feeling of grudge against another person disappears. So those happen either way. Now, in our world, holding a grudge, having a grudge is not stigmatized, but nor do we think it is encouraged. We think it probably looks like less pressure to deal with a grudge in a timely fashion. It looks like a greater social willingness for social groups to consider legitimately the reason why someone might hold a grudge. It looks like not ostracizing people from social groups entirely because they have a grudge against a member, or effort to work around the grudge like this. And we also probably, I think it's worth noting, we're not deleting people's critical thinking ability to assess whether a grievance is legitimate and to assess whether or not a grudge is held on a good channel. So I think people still have that capacity to assess that. Okay, let's move on from setup. Let's talk about people who don't get over it in either world. What kinds of cases are these? I think that's people who have, by and large, legitimate grievances. They are being physically or mentally deeply mistreated, or they experience substantial instances of interpersonal betrayal. And they hold a grudge basically for the reason that it's a self-defense mechanism. This is a large quantity of reason, something that I've already emphasized in my introduction, which is that people disagree with each other in society. Humans are fundamentally imperfect and hurt one another, even if that's not something that is always intentional. And holding a grudge is often something that is self-protective, i.e. it means that you don't have to see someone who harms you, it means you can self-protect your ego against that. Why then is stigmatization of this process terrible for people who keep holding grudges? 5 reasons. First, it delegitimizes their feelings. No matter how serious your grievance is, because it is stigmatized, it manifests as people telling you that that grievance is petty, that grudge is petty, and you shouldn't hold it. And that delegitimizes the seriousness of the harm that has been incurred to you. which re-traumatizes you and often it aids in the process of gaslighting you that wasn't particularly serious. Secondly, we'd say it contributes to a process of social ostracization. People who refuse to leave social groups, despite the fact that they have grudges against people within them, are often socially ostracized from those social groups because of the process of this stigma manifesting. Think about people, and I think we all know them, who are seen as irrational because they hold all these grudges, because they are perceived as the person who, is kind of, for better or for worse, is annoyed about things that have happened in the social group. Those people are often very vulnerable. Those people often need social assistance, but they are not provided by it. They are ostracized. Thirdly, it often leads people to actually reintroduce themselves into unsafe environments because it hastens the process of getting over a grudge. And it says to people that, well, it's probably just best for you that you accept that people in this social group aren't going to support your grudge. Or, you need to either cop it and get over it if you want to stay here or leave. Some people choose to stay and they continue in environments where they're deeply physically unsafe, where they are subject to continual abuse. Fourthly, it's weaponized to exclude people and pressure social groups into negative pieces. Fifthly, often the stigma means that people feel less willing to talk about their grudges, and that actually makes you much, much worse at processing it, and it makes it far less likely that you're ultimately going to process that grudge and move on in a way that is psychologically productive. This is the most important argument in this debate, because it is disproportionately weaponized against people who are otherwise ostracized in their society, because they are neurodivergent, because they have been victimized, and frankly, this is pretty much like 80 to 90% of the debate is weaponized against women who have really legitimate grievances and have had enough pride to publicly confront an abuser. And if we stop that stigmatization, we win this debate by a mile. Let's then talk about the more friendly category for the negative team, which is people who do get over it. And I think this group of people mostly exists in both worlds for the reason that we can see. On net, holding a grudge is not a good thing for a person. It's not a net positive in someone's life. And that's never the claim that we make in this debate. The claim we do make, however, is that you shouldn't make the experience of holding a grudge worse by stigmatizing it. And we would say that it's not the fact that you have a stigma in the first place. It's not operative. The stigma isn't operative in whether people get over the grudge. It primarily affects the speed with which they get over the grudge. It encourages them to get over it quickly. Why then is that hastening bad for people? Firstly, you have less time to process your grievance and move past it in a way that is genuine for you, which means you're more likely to accept unresolved tensions which go on into the future and make you deeply unhappy. You're more likely to hold grudges in the future and be less likely to be able to help yourself through it. But additionally, you're less likely to communicate with others about it and feel comfortable talking about it. And you're less likely to have socially harmonious processes, which we think happen in our world, where we'll actually discuss the contents of grievances and grudges far more, and improve social groups that do harm people, that often do have ingrained processes of racism, of sexism, of ableism, of homophobia and transphobia that does go unchecked. Society would be much worse, would be much better if we regretted this. Sorry.
Occasionally directly address the viewer. The speech will have three things. One point of exchange response, one explanation of how the norm operates and why it's a positive one, and one explanation of why grudges are bad generally and good to the term. Firstly, onto the one piece of exchange response. The previous speaker claims the stigmatisation of holding grudges is an inherently sexist thing. We claim the norm of stigmatisation can be applied in sexist ways because society is a sexist place. It's not inherently sexist. For example, holding grudges is a thing that appears in ancient Icelandic sagas prior, the development of feminism. Guys having beef is a common literary trope across many cultures. Is likely is not necessarily a sexist thing. First, that's my piece of response out of the way. It's just not inherently gender. It can obviously be applied in gender ways. That's part of the way. First question then, how does this norm operate? Obviously, as with so many norm debates, you can't actually meet a norm and talk to them on the street. So, how do you encounter a norm? We say it occurs in the language that people use, in the media that you watch, and obviously through social institutions. Like you see it in school, you see it in religious institutions. People say, let things go, grudges don't help, being vengeful doesn't help, you should let things go, you should try and move on. That is the kind of thing we're talking about, that's the way in which that's the norm people interact with. The second observation about this norm is the question, who applies the norm? We would know, it's very rare for people to discuss grudges with random strangers. It's quite likely that you have a grudge, or your grudges are often within interpersonal groups or within people who actually know each other, which is to say, it's quite likely that people who are applying the norm of stigmatization as they claim are people who you're friends with, who are people who you know. And we would know friends are likely to be quite similar to you, people who know you very well, and people who obviously care about you, which means they're actually well posed to frame this norm in gentle ways. So it's not just get over it, you're being emotional, it's I know you're in a bit of pain, listen, it's time to move on, like let's not deal with this anymore. Third observation. Obviously this norm is mediated by other expectations, which is to say 4 things. 1, people are able to recognize that some wrongs can be deep and traumatic. I would be very, very surprised if a group of friends found out that a member of their friend group was being abused by their partner and was like, listen, you shouldn't be too mad about that. Secondly, we think that people also understand that forgiveness can be complicated and it can be a complicated process. Thirdly, people understand that it can take time to work through pain. Fourthly, people often also feel like they can't tell you how to feel, and they know that if they try, you can very rightfully say, don't tell me how I feel a particular way about this. They understand that that is something that can occur. All of that means, right, because this norm is mediated through these other forces, what this means is the most serious wrongs are not stigmatized under the status quo. Which is to say, having been seriously wronged by someone in an extreme and a very, very unfortunate way is not something your friends are likely to use unreasonable or stigmatize you for holding a grudge or being mad at that particular person. So the question then naturally is like, what kind of grudges does this target, right? And the question that answer to that is actually quite simple. This norm doesn't punish people who hold grudges in the status quo per se. It instead deters people from holding on to insignificant grudges that you can probably otherwise get over. Which is to say, people like to be vengeful, as they say, it's part of human nature. People also like, for example, with their friends getting mad at someone or making fun of someone or dogpiling on someone. What this norm does, is it prevents you from, for example, blowing up at a judge for giving you a bad loss and persisting with that grudge for a long time. And the reason for that, right, is because this norm literally says it's probably not great to be seen as someone who holds grudges. And that's what this norm is, right? Think about it. The way this occurs, right, is you encounter some slight, you get very mad. What this norm forces you to do is it forces you to calm down a little and consider whether it's worth it, whether you can't actually explain it both to yourself and to your friends that this grudge is worth holding. Because it's the process of it trying to explain it, trying to say, no, I'm not being petty here, this really hurt me. That process of explanation, the fact that it's the prospect of if you're worried about the fact that your friends might think of you as someone who unreasonably holds grudges, i.e. stigmatization, it's the prospect of stigmatization that's the thing that forces you to generate reasons to reflect, to think, and then come to a conclusion. And the claim, that's why it's really important, in that speech prior, they're like, oh, well, people can still hold on to their critical reasoning faculties. Our claim is people don't like to think critically because thinking critically is hard and self-reflection is hard. The point is, right, when you know that if your friends, just imagine, someone slights you, you blow up at them, you're really mad, and you persist in holding that grudge for some length of time. Are you more or less likely to do that? Would you do that more or less often if you knew your friends literally wouldn't care and wouldn't notice? Because that's the world they live in. They live in a world where friendship groups don't really mind, and don't care, and don't notice, and don't acknowledge when you are being unreasonable, when you're angrily attacking someone, or when you're holding a grudge, perhaps unreasonably. So what this norm does, by attaching a cost to being angry at someone for a specific period of time, it actually allows us to discern and sift through which forms of anger are probably legitimate, i.e. which forms are very deep and wrong, and because it's your friends who police this norm and the people who care about you, they're quite likely to be able to do that relatively well relative to your interests. But it also means that, it also means that you don't just, don't feel the social permission from their friends to engage in their worst instincts, i.e. get very mad at someone, hold a grudge for a while, and persist in doing so. So, all that explains why this norm, and particularly the prospect of stigmatization, the fact you have to generate explanations that help you get around that stigmatization, that norm is the thing that safeguards this from being misapplied and applied inappropriately. Let's now examine why grudges are bad generally. Which is to say, Even if they claim there are some grudges which are unfairly stigmatised now, why is it just better that stigmatisation encourages people to drop those grudges? There are a couple of things to say here. The first is that there's kind of three things as to why grudges are bad. One, grudges fill you with anger and resentment. Instead of one slight troubling you for some time, and then you eventually recognising it and trying to move on and focusing on other things in your life that bring you any meaning or joy, you're constantly filled with the negativity and exhausting anger that is difficult and takes time to prop up. Secondly, often when you have a grudge against someone, you often end up acting in erratic and in paranoid ways. You actually increase your likelihood of making a further faux pas, because when you own the room with someone, all you can think about is their grudge and the slight and the anger, and you're not necessarily processing or moving through the world in a rational way, or a way that's easily legible to other people around you, which means you're more likely to say silly things or do things that make you seem less popular. The third thing though, and I think this is really important, the grudge itself is often about more than being wronged, right? Many of the times we're wronged and we just kind of cut the person off from our life. We don't talk to them anymore, we just move away, we just want to distance ourselves from that event. Grudges involve recurring to the event, coming back, thinking about it again, getting mad, wanting to reinsert yourself in that person's life, getting involved again. And I think the kind of pain that indicates is something in anger, not just at the other person, who, it's just at the end of that other person, but some anger at yourself. It's a sense of guilt. It's a sense of, I said something bad, they blew up at me and they got really mad at me and they embarrassed me in front of my friends, and I hold a grudge against them that. But the deep down, the betrayal, the anger, there's a guilt there. That's what motivates grudges. It's not just anger at the other person, it's a sense of guilt, a sense of anger at the self. And what the grudge does, being able to focus on the anger only, is a coping mechanism that prevents you from acknowledging how you feel and why you're actually harmed. And this is really important. I've got a good example from my own life, actually. There was once a friend I had who was being really bullied by someone else. And I didn't really do anything about it, in part because I was a little afraid and I didn't know what to say. And the thing that bothered me about it, I held a grudge against this guy for a while, was not that he was mean, but the fact that his meanness was a personal failure. And that's why I was so mad at him. That's why I instead of just moving on and saying he was a dick and doing it, I stewed over it, I couldn't let it go. That is what a grudge is. It's anger at the self that perpetuates. That's why people hold on to it so long, because it's a part of themselves, they're mad at themselves. The second harm here, it's also bad for your friends. Most grudges are personal and they split friend groups, right? People have to take sides, people get mad at having to take sides, they actually increase the likelihood of conflict, people holding further grudges. It's also very unfair on your friends, especially if the grudges are reasonable or if it's just a conflict between two people. Finally, it's often also bad for the target of the grudge, because sometimes grudges are genuinely unreasonable and they should be deterred. Grudges are bad for people. They are a coping mechanism to avoid deeper personal problems. And even if none of them are true, this norm helps us sort out between which grudges are good and which grudges are bad. For all of those reasons, I couldn't be prouder to stand behind this norm.
I think first name with that speech. Whenever everyone is ready, I invite Nicola, you to continue your
According to this negative team, because she was my best friend and someone close in my life, she should have had perfect information as to what kind of things I would and would not hold grudges about. But the problem with that characterization is that it assumes that people have perfect information when they just do not. You don't know what is going on in people's lives. You have no idea what their own lived experiences are. And that means that you can make off-sided comments that people can hold on to for years. The problem with that stigma is that I never address that with her, and it's still something that makes me mad every time we talk about pride. That is something that is only corrected when we no longer have a stigma around this kind of norm. When we no longer have a stigma and people feel that they can communicate to their friends about their grudges and talk about things rather than internalizing them and feel like they are irrational for holding it in the first place. 3 things in this speech. Firstly, how does this norm actually work and how do people respond to it? Second of all, why grudges are actually really important. But I'm actually going to start with something about sexism. Because Brendan tells us that, well, no, grudges and this norm isn't a sexist thing because it started in early literature and in Iceland. Quite famously, where sexism was at the absolute worst. If we think back to fucking Elizabethan England, there's literally no worse time to be a woman. Obviously, it is still incredibly sexist because the reason why women are more likely to hold grudges is because they are the ones that get the worst version of the human experience. They are the ones who have to deal with things like domestic violence and sexual assault on a weekly basis, and they're the ones who don't have a platform to speak about it, especially in that kind of time. So obviously, the norm of holding a grudge started with women, it still exists with women, and that stigmatization is disproportionately put on women. First of all, let's talk about how this norm actually works. Here are 2 claims from this negative team. The first one is that within your interpersonal groups, people apply the norm in a way that works for you and that's often quite gentle because they understand your own preferences. First of all, people are really terrible at mediating their responses to things, right? People are not rational when they respond to their friends, particularly when they're having psychological issues. That's by virtue of the fact that you can do things like bring your own biases to it, but also, secondly, you don't have perfect information about what someone is going through, which means that when you apply the stigmatizing norm, maybe saying something like, oh, it's just a little thing, get over it, you don't have a clue what actually happened to that person. You have their retelling of it to you, but you certainly weren't there, you certainly can't get inside their head, and you certainly can't understand their own contextual parameters in which they're operating. And all of that means that your response can never be perfectly rational. Third of all, some people's friends are just extremely sexist and extremely homophobic, and they probably don't understand everything about you, which means that when they apply the stigma, they're like, oh, you would never think it's crazy when someone tells you about your abuse. A friend would never be like, that's crazy. I think that's completely untrue. I think the reason why domestic violence culture is so bad is because people talk to their friends about it, and they're like, I don't believe you. Like he would never do that. Like, what are you talking about? That's literally how this norm perpetuates, right? It's because people don't believe stories. It's because they make up things in their own head. And it's because they have terrible, historically ingrained tropes that make them incredibly bad. D, obviously, maybe there are some instances in which it is okay to tell your friend, get over it, it was just a comment, whatever, but I think that even if in that particular scenario it's better not to hold a stigma, the problem is in the most serious kinds of scenarios, holding a stigma is incredibly damaging. So maybe there's a benefit to them in like the minutiae of cases where grudges are illegitimate, that people get over them quickly. Take the win, 100%. But 90% of cases where grudges are actually really serious, when you tell someone to get over something, that is when they internalize it, that's when they don't communicate to people about it, and that's when they're more likely to put themselves back into spaces that make them feel unsafe because their friends tell them they'll be socially ostracized unless they get over that grudge in a quick way. Second of all, we hear that it prevents you from blowing up and it prevents you from doing things that are erratic. 3 responses in terms of the scenarios of Boywood Oscar. First of all, you get over it too chastely. The problem with this is it means that you don't talk to your friends and communicate why you had that grudge in the first place, which means you get over it quite quickly. The problem with that is that it just means that future incidents are more likely to occur because you didn't do the groundwork to get over that grudge. Second of all, you pretend you're over the grudge when you're actually not. This is actually the worst scenario, because when you pretend to be over something when you're actually not, it means that you're often thrust into environments that make you feel incredibly uncomfortable. But because you're scared of talking about that grudge, because it socially ostracizes you, it means that you have no ability to talk about it. That means you're in spaces, your friends think it's silly if the grudge is still there because you pretended you got over it, and that is obviously bad. Third of all, and as we tell you at Oscar, the most likely scenario is that you actually never get over it. And I think everyone can think of instances in their own lives in which people have been excluded from social groups because they have a grudge over someone and they're not willing to get over it. The problem is people don't understand the reasons why you're not willing to get over it. Often those reasons are incredibly legitimate, but the way the stigma works is that it forces people to get over it, or if they don't, they're socially ostracized because you're being petty. What are you talking about? This was years ago. Get over it. It doesn't matter anymore. Well, you don't know the person. That's unfair. Incredibly bad stigma in that way. Second of all, let's talk about, are grudges actually good or are they important? Because we hear that the reason grudges are often bad is because it means that you can act in an incredibly erratic way, and often they stem off things that are quite silly. So I think it's true that sometimes grudges do stem off things that are quite silly. But let's talk about the cases in which they are. First of all, what are you more likely to do than act erratically? I think the more rational option that most people opt into is just socially isolating themselves. Because acting erratically in a public environment is actually really embarrassing. And for a lot of people, that's not something they want to opt into because they're not comfortable in that space in the first place. So that means the more likely scenario is that they just step out of that social circle altogether. But the problem is, because often people's social circles are incredibly intertwined, when they opt out of that social circle, they are often opting out of all social interaction. And that is bad because it means that they've got this grudge but simultaneously being excluded from their friendship group. That is bad because they have no support system, and that means that they are effectively disinclined from all of their friends. Second of all, if you do act erratically, I think that is totally justified. Sometimes you just have to act erratically. Sometimes you have to get angry and annoyed because that is the best way for you to experience catharsis. But at least now onto our side, when you do experience that erratic behaviour, instead of people thinking, who is this crazy woman, they think, fuck, she must have had a rough time of it. The ways in which people perceive and internalise those erratic instances are far more productive at the point at which that stigma no longer exists. But finally, when the stigma ceases to exist, you are less likely to act erratic by virtue of the fact that you probably are more likely to talk to people about your grievances, talk to them about your grudges, and instead of them responding to something that is short and cuts you down, they will instead talk to you about the actual problems with it. This negative team is probably going to say, well, you can talk about your friends, you can talk to your friends about your grudges in other ways, like it doesn't have to be framed as a grudge. The problem is, people are really bad at delineating between those two things, right? Like often when you have an issue with someone interpersonally, that is automatically viewed as a grudge, even if it is not. So that means that this stigma applies in basically all circumstances as soon as you have an interpersonal conflict. And what that means is that the way in which people deal with it is far more likely to be the root of shutting it down than helping you. Maybe there are some instances in which people are good friends and they do help you, and I'm sure they exist. But I think for the majority of people, certainly people who are living in circles that are less progressive and know less about mental health and domestic violence, they're probably more likely to take the latter and be the person that tells them to shut up, or at best case scenario for this team, like, oh, rejoin the party, you're totally fine. So, what's important to remember at the end of this speech? I think there's two things. First of all, friends do not have perfect information. Friends don't understand how you are going to react no matter how close they are to you. If they react badly, this stigma is a huge reason why. But second of all, grudges are legitimate, they are important, and they are often an incredibly good way of people expressing their grievances that are incredibly legitimate and ingrained in actual things. Very, very proud to affirm.
Phrases pertaining to your friends not listening to you when you come forward with abuse happening or just general casual homophobia has nothing to do with a grudge. These are probably just genuine opinions they often hold, whether it is because of this being somewhat homophobic or for very reason that they don't want to perceive of your partner or someone who is close to them in such a bad way. Simply because you remove the element of stigmatizing grudge holding does not change this, for the very reason that when you come forward with this grudge, it no longer becomes a legitimate basis for holding a grudge and is still devolved into the same kinds of behaviours. The problem here is that at the point where you come forward, this conflict is still likely to occur. That is why, at best in that team, even if this happened, it is something which still happens under your side of the house, and as a result, that was never ever going to be a win condition. The first thing I'm going to deal with here is just the claim about sexism, and the simple response here is just once again, this norm is not inherently sexist. It is perhaps unfairly applied because women suffer more grievances, but it is not in and of itself a reason to regret stigmatization. For the very reason that if you think about the regular operations of this norm, it is like mothers telling little boys not to pick fights with their friends, or maybe just to have a think before you get really angry and really huffy about some things. It applies at least in a way where it is like in a society which is organically changing towards being more progressive and towards being more understanding towards women, it still has a function here. So just simply regretting it for its sexism, I think, is insufficient. And more so, even if it was sexist, in the absence of this norm, women were still fucked in the Elizabethan era. I don't think you get any meaningful change there. The first thing I'm going to start here with is this discussion about the small slights or the things which people are able to get over. Let's start with some weight, because this team functionally concedes this. I'm going to impact how important it is, which is this is the vast majority of grudges. Because it isn't often that someone becomes irreparably hurt in a way which cannot be repaired. Friends and acquaintances don't often try to hurt their friends in ways which are that debilitating or that harmful. And also, people are capable of coming out and saying things like sorry. Like, for example, you tell another friend, your friend goes, you really hurt them, and you come forward and apologize. There are many circumstances where these grudges simply are things you probably can get over if you have the encouragement to get over. And look, let's think about it this way, right? Think about every single L you took in the debate and got a bit salty about, the times you got stood up for brunch, or the times someone made an offhand mean comment you kind of misinterpreted. Those are things which are the most common forms of grudges which people hold, but that is the thing in which you often should probably just get over here. The assumption on their side is that you get over them because holding a grudge itself feels bad, but I think this is quite unrealistic, because often these small grudges persist in ways which are quite awful, which is to say, even if it eventually feels bad, initially, often it is quite fun to shit talk someone who has caused you grief, whether it is just a way for you to offload your anger, whether it is a way to get group validation when other people go, yeah, that person sucks so much. These are reasons why initially you get maybe a kick of dopamine, initially you have a little bit of fun, but the impact of it is horrible, because it deepens the conflict, because when gossip spreads and gets back to them, it often precludes you from being able to repair this relationship. It also probably means that you start believing that you genuinely dislike this person way more than you have to, which therefore means even if it is a surface release of your kind of pressure valve about how you feel, the behavior you experience is just being incredibly erratic and paranoid, because you don't know whether this person knows this information that you've been bad-mouthing them behind the back, or for the reason that you project, just so that if I was bad-mouthing them, they're also doing it to me. It means that even if this is a relationship which can be recovered, often it goes down a pathway where you do not recover from it, and that is awful, because these relationships can be saved. What we change on the outside is that we force these individuals to recognize, is the reason I'm holding this grudge legitimate? Did this person act in bad faith? And often people just misspeak, often people are impractical language usage, often it just takes you being like, hey, maybe you shouldn't sorry that you just misgendered me, and just letting you know, it's not that big of a deal. All these things actually force you to think back about these processes, and it means you can move on to the vast majority of conflicts. This is a side which entrenches these petty grudges. This is a side which makes these slides worse. This is a side which causes more conflict and friendship growth, and that is why you ought to regret it. But let's talk about where they try to win this debate, which is what they consider legitimate grievances. Their claim here is legitimate grievances such as abuse now don't get listened to, etc. Brendan already explains why this is unlikely for the very reason that often friends are able to be relatively supportive. But if I get on to Bella's response material, I also just want to flag that this is a claim which forgets the other side of the conflict resolution process, which is that often people will recognize it is okay to feel hurt about something and to continue feeling hurt about something if there wasn't ever an attempt to get out a olive branch. There was no attempt for there to be any form of reconciliation. For the very reason that that person did hurt you, and they probably should be something of reparation, because that is something which is fair. To the extent that the other person has apologized, has reached out, tried to make wrongs right, often that's when the stigma kicks in and forces the person to consider, is this a proportionate response to how the other person is feeling? And given that the other person is always one who has to make the move first, it is actually the first step towards conflict reconciliation, and that's why people have to think about whether this grudge is worthwhile. But also note, obviously, that your kind of acceptability of the holding of this grudge is something which is proportionate to the kind of response which happens. So, for example, if apology is insincere, obviously you don't need to forgive them or things like that, which is why I think this kind of process is relatively important in this mediating process, and why this norm actually helps instead of telling someone just to constantly hold on to something which could or may not make them more happy. But specifically what Bella says here is that Bella says, well, friends are often imperfect in providing support because they do not have perfect information. The first thing here that makes it harder for people to reach out to their friends. The first thing is that often communication is the bedrock of a good relationship. So even though maybe it is hard to do so, there is at least a normative expectation that says if you really trust this person, you can actually tell them, because the strength of your friendship means you can get over even the kind of, the grievances which occur between your friendship. Perhaps it results in a bit of a discussion, but that's something you can do. But secondly, even if you cannot talk directly to the friend who has aggrieved you, you also have an extensive network where you can talk to another friend. Maybe it's like, hey, is this reasonable? Can you sense check this for me? Or also, can you maybe, I don't really want to confront them, so can you maybe flag someone else? And that is how communication occurs. I'm not perfect by any means, but it still occurs. And that is because there is an instinct towards wanting to resolve said conflicts. And these are the reasons why I think people are relatively understanding and can have this information. But then we hear this idea that's like, oh, then the next thing I'll just make is that this idea that holding a grudge somehow makes it better is actually a failure in the kind of analysis. Because it just assumes being able to let out a holding this grudge is good because I'm no longer deemed as irrational. They don't actually ever explain the other half as to why it actually solves the conflict, which is to say, under their side, grudges are no longer stigmatized, and perhaps taking them at the best, it is easier to talk about it. Is this to say, I don't think it fixes all of the issues either, right? Because it means that I talk about grievances and slights which people don't actually see as being very reasonable. I kind of nitpick your behaviours. I kind of complain about everything. Like, for example, every time David tells me to walk slowly and it really freaking annoys me because she just should walk faster until that big of a deal, all of those things often come up as being somewhat unreasonable, but because the absence of this law makes it easier for me to talk about it, means I as an individual are likely to pick these fights more, which actually worsen friendships and actually worsens the perceptions of me, and actually means that I as an individual is less likely to recover or to reconcile any grievances which occur. So secondly, which therefore means on the outside, at best, to the extent that it is stigmatized and it's very difficult for you to come out with stuff, it means that every time I do come out with a grievance and I do want to talk to you about something, it means it's serious and you should treat it with the amount of respect out there. In both worlds, people who are awful, people who don't believe things of allegations of abuse, both exist. But at least for our side, there is more of a chance that we get taken seriously. The last thing to note here is Bella lists a bunch of tangible problems as to why it's particularly bad when you can't get over something, which is that when you really can't get over something, you socially ostracize yourself. And it's quite harmful. But the first thing to note here is that stigmatization often actually pushes you towards trying at least a bit harder, and insofar as you cannot actually get over, whereas it is often a pretext or precursor to seeking things like therapy or seeking things like counselling, because your current existing support network is insufficient and you need to reach outside sources who are going to talk to you and help you without any judgment. But that's something which occurs on the outside to the extent you don't want to socially isolate yourself from a group. That was all going to be okay, and it was all going to be, that was the reason as to why it was going to be okay. So at the end of the speech, what you all believe is that you have to weigh stuff like the small slides quite substantially, because those often become, irreparable slides. But the second thing to note here is that legitimate grievances can be dealt with. Friends are imperfect, and maybe they make mistakes, but at least they're better than no one, and they still try their best to do the best for their friends.
think both teams in this debate agree that grudges are incredibly natural responses when people care about things, when they're competitive, when they're passionate, when they find something genuinely meaningful. And therefore, they tend to internalize and will hold grievances regardless, in the same way that they will distinctly remember when an adjudicator robs them of debate they think is particularly important for them. The question is how they react to this stigma. Because if you imagine a world where in debating, it was absolutely not okay to resent adjudicators that really, gave you incorrect losses. If it was not acceptable for you to badmouth that adjudicator, to vent a little bit to your friends, when you're seen as really petty and immature for doing that, the reaction is not, this forces you to be self-reflective of how immoral you are as a person for resenting this adjudicator. The natural reaction is to bottle that emotion, to never make it a public thing that you talk to your friends about, to self-defensively just suppress that and think there is something kind of bad about me feeling this way. And this team sees it is a perfectly natural and human response to feel grudges. It is totally normal for people to go through that set of emotions. That was the moment where I just don't believe that people need to be forced upon some form of self-reflection. These people are human. They can learn this themselves. They can kind of learn to grapple with maybe this adjudicator robbery wasn't the end of the world. And that was the problem with the opposition team. Because every step of the way, they want their people's friends to support them. They want to accept them. They want their friends to say, we're going to help you along this process. And then in the same breath, seem to consistently blame the victim as if it's their fault. That it's unhealthy, that it's good for you to go through this process. You need to be forced to self-reflect, that you're the one that's causing the division in social groups. Totally bizarre, because our team is not a coward in this debate, and we make the trade-off. That yes, there will be some little boys that pout a little bit and are a bit huffy for a little bit longer because they don't get over the grudge as fast now. Who cares? We think there are a set of individuals that self-reflect to their wits' end, who have devolved themselves into serious self-blame, that still get told that they should move on, that they are causing the disruptions in their friend groups. That was clearly the more serious incident that we overwhelmingly won this debate on. The key reason, and the key contention of side opposition over this type of very serious grudge that people are constantly delegitimized over, that are constantly socially ostracized and feel incredibly incapable of publicly coming forward to communicate about, is they say that, well, if you have a serious problem, why don't your friends with good intentions kind of just help you out and make sure that you go through that process? This is like such a Eugene robot response. It's just like, there are several problems with it. The first is that you interact with more than just your closest friends that genuinely understand the serious trauma that you've gone through in your life. I think the vast majority of people that have gone through sexual assault or serious grievances don't tend to just tell acquaintances or every single person left, right and centre of those grievances. And so the way that this manifests is the exact stuff that opposition sees in the debate. That yes, there are people that come across as somewhat erratic or somewhat irrational. They come across as that person in the social group that's forcing others to take sides. They come across as a person that's like kind of awkward to be around because they seem to just hold these grudges so strongly. And the instinctive reaction for those people that aren't the closest friends of those type of people is to distance themselves. Yes, they might try and understand or sort of tentatively get that there might be something going on here, but they're not going to get involved. They're not going to genuinely, emotionally invest in this type of individual. The instinctive reaction is to distance themselves. And when we make the argument that it is weaponized by people in social groups, we don't mean that in a very intentional, deliberate, we want to attack this person. We mean this in a very instinctive manner. That when people are seen in social groups to hold grudges badly, because this stigma says grudges are bad, they're a problem, you assume that that grudge is less legitimate, even if that grudge is incredibly legitimate. It means that you're far less likely to understand this person who is erratic, who is irrational, has a grudge that is legitimate and acceptable, and try and work around the fact that that person has that grudge, and rather your instinct is it is their fault, that they hold that grudge, they should move on from that grudge, that will make this social thing far easier for me. And I think that is the actual conception of why it is not just about closest friends, it is about more extended social groups. But unfortunately, even the closest of friends sometimes do fall short. And that is because they do have imperfect empathy. It is really hard to understand what people have gone through, and it is often incredibly unpleasant and painful to directly and personally empathise those feelings. It is not a surprise that different people have different reactions to that, and I'm not going to be the perfect, godlike type of psychologist that is going to help their friend go through that process. What that means is, I wish that everyone at every single point in time got to interact with people that really knew them, that would support them unconditionally, that would understand that they have a grievance, but that simply was magnified constantly by a stigma that this grievance shouldn't be held, and that this grievance, this grudge is deeply unfortunate. I think the problem is that even the best of friends have an instinct, an optimism, that wouldn't it be nice if my friend could move on from this grudge? Even if they genuinely recognise that it's a legitimate grudge, they agree and understand this is a grudge that I can empathise why it occurs, I still think that these people would encourage that person to move on. I still think that these close friends would say, hey, this is kind of causing tensions in our social group, maybe don't make such a big deal out of it or play it out in certain ways. I think that is what activates the huge harms that come out at first and are not ever directly rebutted, right? Harms such as this genuinely just feels awful to people, when they feel far less comfortable coming forward to their friends, because they just have an irrational fear, a genuine sense that people understand that grudges are not normal, and their friends want them to not hold that grudge. It is what makes them more hesitant to communicate in the first place. It's what encourages them to bottle up, to keep those grudges private. And that is exactly how we activate our harms on people feel like they are forced into unsafe environments just because they cannot openly express their concerns with that grudge. They feel like their emotions are delegitimized. Their friends are likely to distance themselves to some extent to further exacerbate those harms. Do you think the benefits on our side are really clear here? When there is a social norm that you as a friend should accept that people hold grudges, and that is inevitable, and that is okay, your incentives as a friend, if it is true that the opposition says there are a lot of really good people out there, your incentives are now, rather than to encourage that person to move on, to not hold that grudge, to instead work around that. To accept that this person will always hold this grudge, how can we make this social group work despite that? I think that is really important, actually allowing friends to also engage in a better way. Last, this outcome, I think, very, very clearly wins us the debate for three broad reasons. First, the most obvious, that it's by far the most serious type of grudges, and these are the most long-term grudges, grudges that people will hold for their entire lives. So, it is incredibly important to these people. These people are incredibly vulnerable. They are typically the individual that are seen as the most different in a group, they're the most mentally unstable, have the most self-esteem issues, they're very frequently women as the stigma is placed disproportionately on them. And to the extent that we think the harms on these people are so much more likely, we couldn't care less about what opposition brings in this debate. And what they do bring is, but sometimes it's kind of painful, it makes social groups more awkward, it's kind of a bad coping mechanism. Do you think people love to hold grudges? The thing is, we would always support people erring on the side of, firstly, taking more time to go through their emotions and process them, but secondly, erring on the side of letting individuals cope with this on their own, rather than constantly forcing them to self-reflect and to push them, to instead let them as an individual rationalize and work through those emotions. That is why we don't think the case of small grudges is important, but we also actually think it is worse as well.
Eugene's introduction does an excellent job of distinguishing one of the key problems with their case, and that is their failure to understand that there's a difference between being mad in the moment, an instantaneous and legitimate emotion, and then going on to hold a grudge against someone. Because yes, if you think that a judge has given you an unfair loss, that is a reason to be mad. It's only natural that you would respond with anger, you'd be upset about it, and it's totally fine to then complain to your friends, to discuss it, to say that you're upset about that call, to express your feelings. But it would be very strange and very bad for you to then go on to hold a grudge about that. To think about it at night, like weeks, months, years later, to remember the anger of that moment and how bad it made you feel, to end a relationship over it, to not talk to that judge again, to feel constant guilt about it, and that is exactly why it is that grudges were bad. It was fine to feel emotions, but what we contended on side negative was that grudges were not only counterproductive for the people who felt them, they were bad for everyone else involved. I'm going to discuss two issues in this speech. Firstly, we're going to discuss the most common type of grudges, which we contend are often relatively trivial, and because they are by far the most common, they are by far the most important. I will then discuss the serious grudges that this team only wants to engage with, to the exception of more important parts of the debate. Our contention here is pretty simple. Humans are irrational, and humans are emotional, and as a result, our normal reaction to not getting our way is to feel anger, is to feel wrath, is to feel betrayal, and is to respond in a way that makes us want to get revenge or want to get even against the person we perceive has wronged us. But in the vast majority of circumstances, those wrongs are often not even real wrongs. We misread a situation, we lost a debate, which is a legitimate thing that can happen, you got stood up at an event, someone took a joke a bit too far and your feelings got hurt. These are just things that happen. Life and social interactions are full of friction, sometimes we get hurt, and it is fine to feel bad in the moment, but that should not be, we contend, the basis for forming a long-term grudge. And we contend the problem is, in the absence of this norm of stigmatization, there is nothing to prevent you forming grudges on the basis of these interactions. It is only on side negative, where we have this norm, where you feel that you must then explain to your friends why it is that you're so mad, like weeks after, at the judge who gave you a loss, and then you realize, oh, well, there isn't really a good reason for that, and you don't have that grudge. It is only on side negative we have to rationalize, is this a grudge that I could explain to others? Is it something that's worth being mad about? Should I just let it go? That you actually are able to invoke those rational thought processes. And note that they never give you an actual process for how you get over being mad at someone on their side. They're just well, obviously, people don't want to be mad, so they won't be, ignoring the way that emotions work. If you've spent ages being really mad at someone, it's very hard to then just be oh, I was wrong, and not be mad at them. You need the push of this particular norm to tell you that you need to reconsider, because otherwise, your anger just builds upon more anger. The fact that you were mad at them before means that you want to continue feeling mad at them, because you hate the idea of the cognitive dissonance necessary to suddenly be oh, I was mad at them, but I guess they did nothing wrong. You were mad at them, so you find reasons to be mad at them. You justify and come up with other excuses to be mad at them. And it's only on our side that we are able to avoid that very big harm. Why is this by far the most important claim in the debate? Firstly, if you think about the number of slights people experience, it is very rare that people are abused or experience a very grievous wrong, as this team suggests. But it's very common that you misread a social situation, or that you lose a debate, or that something doesn't go your way. And we explain to you that on side affirmative, without this norm, there's nothing to stop each of those things ending a relationship. There's nothing to stop you being permanently mad about that particular interaction. There's nothing to stop the build-up of rage and pain and guilt inside you that makes you feel bad forever about that event. It is only on our side where you avoid a world which is far more hostile and a world that is far more arbitrary by being able to process those emotions. You could be mad on side negative, but on side affirmative, you were always holding a grudge, and that was bad. And because this was by far the most common set of incidences, and because every one of them had devastating consequences, you ended a relationship over it, it was really bad. Even if we lose the second issue in the debate, we are a side in which you maintain far, far more relationships as a result, in which you don't permanently feel guilt and shame over every negative interaction you've had, which had to win us the debate. Let's now go engage with, what they wanted to talk about and explain why, even in the instance of serious grudges and on the most charitable terms, this material is insufficient to get them to the win in this debate. They identify correctly that people can be the victim of serious grievances, such as abuse within a relationship, you could be assaulted, you could be seriously betrayed, and they say in these situations, you should and it is natural to hold a grudge. Once again, we distinguish it is obviously legitimate in these circumstances to be angry, to be upset, to be betrayed, and it might sometimes be the case that as a result you do hold a grudge, but we explain that that is fine because there is no harm on our side to these things. Because we explain that our norm already caters for the fact that some types of grievances are more significant than others. For example, we point out that the primary way you experience the stigmatization is from your social circle and from your friends, because you don't generally go around like talking about your grudges to random strangers or to people on the street. It's primarily your friends and your social circle, because grudges are deeply personal, who would know about it. And that they, as people who are friends with you and like you and care about you, are unlikely to be like particularly callous about the fact that you've experienced a very deep and traumatic experience. Secondly, we explained to you that people in general understand that some wrongs are very serious and traumatic, and they understand that people might have very intense and traumatized reactions to those things. So they're unlikely to apply a particular stigma in that instance. We would say this norm isn't just like, you know, an impervious force that applies in all instances. It's obviously mediated by the friends who apply it, who obviously have your best interests at heart. Thirdly, we explain that people understand that forgiveness is complicated, so even if they think you should get over it, they might understand that it might take you a while to get over it. They might understand that you might have feelings to process before you can get over it. They might understand that you need to go to therapy before you can get over it. And all of that is likely to mean that they don't treat you in the ways that this team suggests they do. But lastly, and most importantly, people know that they can't control how you feel. They understand that it's legitimate to be mad and you can't just like stop being mad, but they can assist you in the process of moving on by talking about it and helping share all of those things with you. Which is why all of their harms, when they tell you people will ostracize you, shame you, or delegitimize you, seem very unlikely. What are the reasons they give you for why this claim is likely? They say your friends are biased and have limited info, so they might not be perfect in the way that they interact with you. This is obviously true. Your friends are not immortal deities, but we would point out that friends generally, when they recognize that a very serious grievance has gone on, are likely to err on the side of empathy, and are probably unlikely to be like, oh, that just doesn't seem so bad or something, if you tell them that you've been assaulted or something like that. That seems like a very unlikely response that in the vast majority of circumstances would not occur. But secondly, we'd suggest that even in the absence of stigmatization of grudges, the kinds of people who are likely to behave in that callous a manner are probably still likely to behave in that callous a manner. It's probably not something that is negotiated by this particular norm. Secondly, they say that a big problem is that your friends might be homophobic and not respond well when you say that, you know, you've experienced homophobia, or your friends might not believe that your partner was abusive or that you were assaulted. The problem here obviously isn't this norm. The problem is that they refuse to believe you when you tell you that you were the victim of traumatic experience. We would say, one, you should know that so you can stop being friends with them, because they're clearly not people you should be around. But two, we'd say that obviously, on their side, you don't help this either. Like, even if they believe it's legitimate to hold grudges, they won't think it's legitimate to hold a grudge on the basis of something they don't believe happened. Like, you can't be like, I have a grudge against my partner because they were abusive. They'll be like, no they weren't. Like, why are you mad? Like, the fact that the grudge is legitimate doesn't help the fact that these are just bad people you obviously should not associate with. But finally, we explained to you that even in the instances where you have suffered these serious grievances, it is often good to have a force that assists you in moving on. On their side, like, yes, you legitimately feel angry in the moment, but it's probably good for you to stop thinking about that event, stop re-traumatizing yourself by living it over and feeling that shame that victims so often feel. But that is best mediated when people give you the tools to allow you to move on, to allow you to realize that thinking about this is not in your own best interest. They deny you the tools that were a necessary part of human reality for people to move on, to turn their emotions to a rational process that allowed them to interact.
The story from side Affirmative is that every person who holds a grudge has been rightfully wronged, and that therefore this stigmatization is cruel. It prevents friends from having important conversations, it prevents victims from receiving recognition as being genuinely victimized, and it encourages people to bottle up emotions and let them fester. Side negative explains a set of things which mitigate these harms and explain why the norm doesn't backfire. The first thing side negative tells you is that the harms that they identify around your friends not believing that you have been, not believing that they have been homophobic or not believing because you've been abused, unfortunately exist independently of holding grudges. And the question you can ask that answers this is, would a homophobic person consider a grudge from a queer person legitimate if they did not have a stigma against grudges? Or would someone who doesn't want to believe allegations of abuse start believing them if they no longer saw them as an illegitimate grudge? And the answer to both of these questions is no. And the reason for that is that by definition, a homophobic person doesn't think they said that the thing they said was wrong, and the person who doesn't want to believe abuse just refuses to believe that abuse happens. It is characterized as a grudge or not grudge, an illegitimate grudge or illegitimate grudge that is separate from the harm that is experienced there. And as we explained, it is best that this person perhaps moves on. The other material we hear, especially at second affirmative, is that this prevents conversations from friends being had. We would point out, in the set of cases they identify, where there's two very close friends and that is the real cause of harm, that in many instances, very close friends are able to develop ways of just having difficult conversations, and then in many cases over time, they can have those conversations. But secondly, even if you do not believe that, side negative are also able to explain that it is the desire to not hold a grudge and not be seen or view oneself as someone who holds a grudge that is a motivator to bring peace. Because the thing that says, I don't want this to be a grudge that hangs around me, I don't want to be someone who holds on to this pain, please let's talk about this so we can deal with it. But even if that was not accepted, side negative have a second line of response. And that second line of response is to explain that grudge holding makes things worse for the grudge holder in three ways. Firstly, because of the pain, because of the way in which you often have to rationalise that grudge, add new reasons to that grudge, and generally the social anxiety that comes with holding a grudge, interacting with someone you have a grudge against, means that you behave in irrational ways. And I think side affirmative slightly misunderstand the point of side negative's claim here. The point is not that these people are annoying. The point is it motivates you to do dumb things, make dumb decisions, say irritating things, or confront people in ways that end up backfiring against you socially and harming you. Secondly, in some cases, holding a grudge prevents self-growth, and this material actually receives no response, which is to say, some grudges are about more than the other person who is being held, the grudge is being held against, and more about the fact that you feel you failed in some way, and the anger is a reflection of your guilt or a reflection of your failure. Like in the way you might feel very mad and the judge has given you a loss because it actually indicates that you lost the debate and you failed in that way. The final thing we explain, and there is no real response to this also, is that grudges hurt to hold. They hurt to hold. Side affirmative never explains why the juice is worth the squeeze in that instance. Finally though, side negative have a third way of winning debate. They explain this norm has other benefits. And at second affirmative, it is accepted that with small grudges, this norm is useful. This concession is important because it tells you that side affirmative recognises that without this norm, the number of total grudges in the world would go up, right? Because there are many cases where this norm effectively prevents people from holding grudges. That is what concession means. The affirmative says, no, grudges don't go away, they encourage you to bottle it up. To which side negative obviously can point out that, not everyone is Richard Nixon and remembers every slight they've ever experienced, but also people let go of grudges, which is what this norm is encouraging you to do. It's encouraging you to be a person who does not hold those grudges. Which is to explain that under the world that side affirmative wants, perhaps some grudges in their best case are seen as more legitimate than others, and then they would be under ours. But there are far more grudges, which means that people experience a far greater degree of interpersonal conflict in a way that totally makes having friends quite painful. Because of that, because grudges hurt to hold, and they hurt to what other people hold. Please side.
Okay, they will apply to that speech. I then invite Apply to conclude the debate.
I've written at the end of the reply, I urge you to vote neg. So I'm going to change that so I don't make that. I'm going to start on neg turf. These are the grudges that people should get over. Your petty interpersonal grievances, your misinterpretations that get too big. And negative do a good job, I think, in this debate, showing that it's qualitatively preferable for people to get over those grudges and not to experience them. But there's two ways to understand that we win this group of people. The first is to ask the question, do people get over grudges more in the absence of this norm? To be honest, it's pretty unclear from Team Negative what their actual definitive mechanism to getting this is in this debate. Their two closest are, first, you sift through grievances that are, decide which ones are legitimate, and you have this force acting on you to consider what grievances are worth expressing. But neither of those explain that people stop feeling the grudge, that people stop feeling deep inside the reason that they hold that grievance and that grudge in the first place. They only explain why it is that people's expression of that grudge does not have negative externalities. And we explain, because grudges are a natural human experience, because they're a rational response to times when we don't get exactly what we want, the grudges happen in either world. And really the most prominent effect of this norm is to push grudges that people were going to experience in either worlds into a different sphere. And that leads me on to the second claim, which is the harm that I think goes drastically under-responded to, which is that what happens when people truncate their process of self-reflection. Negative, I think this is a thing that causes you to rationally reflect on your anger. But far more often, we think it causes you to bite it in ways that are harmful to you. You internalize it, you pretend you're over it, and you introduce yourself into unsafe social spaces where your resentment grows and festers. And you only for the reason that you want to stay socially popular in circles like debating. There's time and social room to discuss grudges without fear. And that's the pathway to moving past a grudge. It's glib to suggest that we ignore this group, and it's even glibber to suggest they're the most important, but we clearly win this group. Let's go on to our turf then. Grudges people shouldn't get over. These are deep betrayals of trust. These are instances of emotional, physical, and sexual abuse. Negative and I think mostly their responses suggest they're not really in the scope of the debate, but they have three strategies to get around this. The first is to suggest people are overwhelmingly still supported by their friends, despite this norm. Note about this is essentially a piece of mitigation. Our frame throughout the debate is that the stigma around grudges is a barrier to people being good friends to one another. At best, you help your friend in an unhelpful way, because as the negative team thinks, you think you're helping your friend when you tell them that it's best for them to get over a stigma. But what in fact you are doing is invalidating a deeply held experience of theirs that they internalized for years. At worst, your friends totally disbelieve you when you bring them an instance of a serious grievance. At worst, you're totally ostracized from your only social networks because you're seen as too difficult, you complain too much, and often people aren't totally aware of why you have that grievance. And that's horrible. The second is to establish there's a minority of cases. There's obviously more than one way to weigh an issue in debating. Our harm is larger. It just affects people more severely, right? People are pushed out entirely out of their social circles rather than doing sometimes embarrassing instances of anger. They are pushed to return into unsafe and unchecked environments. They feel entirely alone and as if no one cares about them. And that's only worse for the people doing that to them by their friends. Their final suggestion is this is an independent social force, this is only, sexist and homophobia of society. They're consistently uncharitable to our claim that this is a deeply, intrinsically sexist norm. As I explained in my speech and in Bella's, women experience more grievances because they experience sexism, of course, and they're disempowered from expressing it, which makes them very likely to be people who experience these grudges, which mean they're the people who experience the stigma against it more. But of course, it's true, we don't solve all social ills, but we get rid of a prominent barrier that makes people worse communicators, it makes people worse friends, and it makes people worse people. For that reason, because we win both groups in this debate, but we win the second group overwhelmingly, I urge you to vote for Affirmative.